Hello, everyone. Professor Philip Travis here, and it is our final week here in American History 1. And this week we are going to be looking at the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I'm going to talk about this image you see here in a moment. So we have our third test this week, and because it is our last test, and of course because we wrote an essay last week, a major essay last week, this test will be only multiple choice and true false. So you won't have to worry about writing 2-paragraph responses on the test. The third test is not cumulative. It covers the material since our last test. And again, there won't be a major essay. There might be a fill in the blank or something like that along with the multiple choice true false questions, but it won't have major essays on the test since we wrote the major essay last week for the class. Looking at the Civil War and Reconstruction. The factoid, I'm going to go ahead and just get right to the factoid. I'll make this kind of short so it's not too long. And remember, of course, as always, I have my weekly video lectures, and I have more than one lecture this week for you on the American Civil War. The factoid relates to this political cartoon you see depicted here. During the Civil War, most of the times when folks think about the Civil War, from a military standpoint, they think about battles like the Battle of Gettysburg or even the Battle of Vicksburg or the Battle of Antietam. And the Civil War was a frighteningly brutal conflict. It was an industrial war. You had soldiers on battlefields that were armed now, like every soldier, every infantryman effectively was armed with a rifle, right? A muzzle-loading rifle, but a rifle. And some, of course, might have had repeater rifles, but everyone's using rifled weapons is the point. And a rifle, of course, as I'm sure many of you might be aware, is far more deadly and far more accurate than a smoothbore musket, which would have been more commonplace during the wars like the American Revolution. And so a rifle fires at a much higher velocity, it is much more accurate, and has a far greater destructive power. American soldiers during the American Civil War were using rifles, but they were in many ways fighting in the ways that conventional armed forces would have fought during the Revolutionary Age of warfare. And so you would have been talking about, formations, like infantry squares in close combat type fighting with these types of weapons. Well, the Civil War is really one of the first industrial wars. And so you had not only rifles in the hands of your soldiers, but you also had a much more advanced sort of force brought to bear through artillery, like cannon fire and so forth. And on the grounds and the battlefields, these types of things gave rise to a level of death that is, for the time, incomprehensible. And today, to this day, the American Civil War is still the most deadly conflict in American history, in United States history, with the death toll from the North and the South upwards of around 700,000, which is more than Americans have lost in any conflict, including World War II. So it's the most destructive war in American history. It was an industrial war. It was a war that had, there were battles that lasted several days and witnessed shocking numbers of casualties. 10,000 casualties in a battle. These types of figures were not unheard of from the most destructive and terrifying battles of the American Civil War. Battles like the Battle of Antietam, for example. So it was an industrial war, and of course this brought tremendous casualty figures. It transformed the nation in so many ways. The actual fighting of the war did, and whether it's related to medical techniques or the aftermath of the war and the development of the 14th Amendment, which of course is the constitutional amendment that made all peoples born in the United States citizens. The 14th Amendment is the ultimate federal protection to people's constitutional rights in the United States. It comes from the Reconstruction period. Another, and this will be the factoid, another element of the warfare and fighting of the American Civil War, which is not really thought about nearly as much as those battles like Gettysburg, for example, was the naval war. And during the American Civil War, there was a rather intense naval war. Now, some of the naval wars were fought on coastlines. Oftentimes, they were fought on riverways like the Mississippi River. But the naval war resulted in some highly advanced sort of industrial methods of making war on the high seas. And this, what you see depicted here, is Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was he was really an American hero from the Mexican-American War, and he was older during the Civil War, but from his influence as an advisor to Abraham Lincoln, Winfield Scott helped to mastermind the creation of what became known as the Anaconda Plan. And the Anaconda Plan, and I'm going to get back to the naval stuff in a second, the Anaconda Plan was a plan to make a naval blockade around the Confederate States, to deny them access to equipment, goods, supplies, food, these types of things, from international powers who might seek to trade with the Confederate States out of their own sort of a desire to sort of take advantage at the sort of the division in the United States at the time. Certainly the British and the French were both involved in such efforts. And so the Confederates had ships called blockade runners that would try to break these blockades to sort of create trade relationships with some of those European powers, and efforts like that were undertaken. But the United States, one of the more important elements of the United States effort against the Confederacy was, in fact, not only the fact that the North possessed the industrial sort of infrastructure of the country, but also that the North was, through that infrastructure, capable of blockading the Confederate States. And it used advanced, and this is the factoid, it used oftentimes advanced naval technology that included ironclad ships. And ironclad ships were ships that were sort of a precursor to the eventual armored navies that you would see dominating the high seas at the turn of the 20th century. Ironclads were ships with thick plating on them to protect them from cannon fire. In response to this, and you can just summarize this as you see fit for the factoid, the Confederacy, went to great lengths to try to break the blockade, to try to have some effect in a naval war that it was hugely at a disadvantage in. And of course, it had ships called blockade runners that were trying to break the blockade to bring supplies in the South. But it even witnessed the innovation of the first sort of true submarine. And this submarine was called the CSS Hunley. And if you ever wanted to see the CSS Hunley, the CSS Hunley is in Charleston, South Carolina. It's a very primitive submarine, but it has the traditional shape of a submarine, and it would sink a ship by ramming it with it had a torpedo explosive sort of barb on the end of it. Well, it did sink a ship. It sank the Housatonic. But in the event of sinking the Housatonic, the CSS Hunley sank itself. It was a very experimental machine that was driven by human power, but was an example of some of the innovative naval technology, like the ironclads during the war. So ironclads in the CSS Hunley, the first submarine. Let's have a great week. Focus on your test, and let me know if you have any questions. And let's have a great week, and I hope to see some of you in a class of mine in the future. I hope you've really enjoyed this class, and I might give you an extra bonus point or two from this factoid because it's a little long. But let's have a great week, everyone.